there was a lot of good points came up this video, and I think our viewers, I hope, got a kind of a good idea of the COVID pandemic implications already and the role of media. But before going a bit deeper, what Sven Erik Bucht said in that, there was about the role of politicians and the media to hold the politicians accountable. For really understanding how the situation was on the ground and what was the practical consequences on people when the borders were closed during the pandemic, let's maybe try to portray that picture, because even for me, coming from the same country but 400 kilometers down south, I couldn't tell. So kind of shedding light to our international and domestic viewers, how was it like? What was the concrete implication?
I guess, there was a lot of, what's the word? We felt that we were those who continually move across the border in our daily life, that we were intimidated in our daily life. I mean, for my personal life, the biggest intimidation that I experienced was I had kids aged 2 and 5 in the car, and they're not my biological kids, but they're kids that I have been a father figure for, and the Border Patrol agent asked me about the kids, which is really not any of his business, but he asked about the kids, because at the time we showed passports also, and he asked about the kids, and I was forced to say that they're in the kids' native language that I'm not their father, which hurt me very much, because all along I have been saying that I'm dad. Okay, so I'm not. They know now that they're older, I'm not their biological father, but I always emphasize that I'm dad to them.
Mm-hmm. That's a very concrete example of how it affected. And so thinking that like people weren't able to go to work, you weren't able to go to see your relatives or family members that lived on the other side of the border. Thinking of the kind of surviving and livelihood, do you have some concrete examples about that as well? Did it actually kind of took a living out of some people? How?
Again, my profession now has been in the music industry, so depending also, and also in some interpretation work, and obviously all that field of work was affected by the pandemic. I couldn't go on tour, and it also specifically the border, I feel, made, because our band members live in Sweden, some of us, I do, and there was, even though bands toured Finland, there was it wasn't necessarily outspoken, but I felt that there was we weren't asked to play because of we were from Sweden, just because of this fear of the COVID infection. Yeah.
I guess like also in the video that was an interesting point, that because we had a lot of media coverage about, of course, I guess it's a natural thing in Finland that we compare to Sweden. And there was a lot of discussion about how Sweden is handling the pandemic, and about the looser restrictions and so on. And it came back to the kind of national identity question somehow. That's like, who is Swedish, who is Finnish. We discussed it already earlier, but is this somehow like an identity question as well?
Unfortunately, that's where discussion went, I think. And as you were saying, the media drove this also because I think it was financially made sense to make headlines that portrayed Finland and Sweden different.
Yeah. I think the fear is maybe the most political sentiment or a feeling, and because of that it also sells the best. Hatred is quite close, but fear is, and suspicion is where things start from. And that's how the stories were sold during the pandemic. And if you look only the Finnish media, the fear and suspicion, it was our eyes were gazing towards Sweden, and there was a fear, obviously, that the Swedish people will come to a Finnish side and bring the disease within them, or if some from the Finnish side would go to Sweden and come back, she or he would bring the disease, the COVID, with herself over there. And that's how it went, I guess, in the first place. But quite soon, when you repeat something like this, you start to create larger images or discourses on whole communities or nations. And you start, connect or link new kinds of qualities to those communities. And in this case, the politics of Swedish government and maybe the attitudes of Swedish people were portrayed as irresponsible, at least between the lines, between the sentences. Maybe it was not said out loud, but that was the image that was created, that Swedes don't know what they are doing, they are irresponsible, people are dying. And when you go to this kind of level, it becomes a question of national identity, even if you don't say it out loud. But identities are made out of these kinds of, political feelings, and that's how it goes. And I felt it also. I live a bit more far from the border, 100 kilometers from the border, but I go often to the Swedish side because of my work, but also because of my hobbies. And I go tens of times annually to a Swedish side, and went also during the pandemic. And I really felt that when I went there and came back to Rovaniemi, it was not clever to tell everybody that I just went to Sweden and came back from there, because people would have feared me. And it was obviously a strange situation.
And in the beginning, especially, there was a lot of fear, like especially in the beginning, like in many levels. But on the video, Sven-Erik Puth also brought up that somehow the feeling was that the decisions and the discussion was like kind of held or done by people that weren't from here, or somehow that like kind of the people that this decision actually affected weren't like engaged at all. Like this seems to be the feeling. And I started also thinking myself that if I just follow this from the media as such, you couldn't really relate, because at least I don't remember that it was somehow like explained that why it was such a big thing to close the border, that it was somehow, of course this is not a fact based on research, this is just a kind of observational reflection, but it felt that it was discussed from the point of view that like it became a huge debate at what the Finnish constitution says about the right to leave the country. But it didn't really explain that why it was such a big thing. Why it is a big thing to close the border. how did you feel the media, how media was handling this? Did you feel that it left out the local perspective on things?
Certainly the discussion was owned by people outside of those affected. And I think for anyone else but people who actually live and breathe this area and live a cross-border everyday life, it is hard to grasp the extent of the borderless nature of our lives, where we go for lunch over to the other country, where we in the morning take our kids to school in the other country, go to work back to the other country, and where we cross the border multiple times, like even 8 times a day for some people, 8-10 times, just not even reflecting on it. It's difficult for anyone not living this it's easy for anyone outside to think, to imagine a life where we actually would be living side by side but separately, and only go over the border to shop some specific groceries or something that's cheaper on either side. But that's not the reality.
Yeah, it's a much deeper question than not being able to travel to Thailand once a year, which was a kind of the discussion about the closing the borders, that oh dear, now we cannot have holidays as such.
Yeah, I think that the Council of Tornio Valley appealed to Finnish and Swedish governments maybe once or twice, and they wanted to border to be kept open, but none really listened, and it was in media, but didn't get really that much of a coverage, and I think actually that what Adam said, it's absolutely correct that in the first place journalists also from other places than Tornio Valley, it's really difficult for them to understand the lived reality in the region, and that's why it's really difficult to make questions from that perspective. And then also, as Sven-Erik Bucht said, also journalists are human beings, and they, I guess, feared the COVID pandemic as any other people did. And because of this, they saw that if there is even a small theoretical opportunity to slow down the pandemic by closing the border, one should close the border, never mind what the local peoples say over there. And because of this kind of thinking, they perhaps thought, maybe subconsciously, that it's meaningless what those locals people say in the region. Yeah, because those stories, they were quite rare in the media, which would really be trying to describe and go deeper into the nature of the area. If you think this, it's for the locals here, it's the same that if you would draw a border in the middle of any city in Europe, in Helsinki, in Brussels, Warsaw, or whatever city. In Berlin, we've had such a border, but for locals it would be a similar kind of a thing, something really strange happening inside the community.
Do you feel that there is some long-term implication on this, that the border was closed? Did it somehow change the nature of the community? Or is it too soon to say?
It certainly changed, and as Sven-Erik said, we lost a lot of progress, and we have a lot of uphill work to do to catch up and bring back. And also I think maybe we shouldn't concentrate on the things that we lost first and foremost, specific things, but maybe develop other things, and through that we will see, and in the end we will mend those specific things that are that hurtful now. But if we advance other things around, then maybe we can reconciliate with the things that we lost and mend them later.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say what will be the long-term consequences. It's up to us as residents of the area to change things. But at the moment, I think that after the 2015 and 16 and COVID pandemic, in the minds of some people, the border really now is higher, and they really know and remember that there is a border now. And when the next crisis comes, it's easier to close it again. Well, we don't know what happens now when Finland and Sweden are going together to NATO and really loving each other at the moment. So maybe it will affect the things. But then again, it may be easier, to declare again the state of emergency again and close the border, because we now have examples on how to do it. So there is a certain dangers lurking over there, and in the minds of some people, the border really now is over there. And another thing that I've noticed is that there is a certain kind of disappointment, especially maybe in Swedish side of a Tornio Valley, because as Sven-Erik said, people felt in Swedish side that they are portrayed in Finnish media as contagious, and even some people living in the Finnish side of the border started to think like that. So that's quite insulting, and there is a certain sentiment of disappointment. People are disappointed on how things went. They think that this cross-border cooperation is nice rhetorics, but in the end it's only rhetorics. When something that can be portrayed as crisis comes, you can forget the cross-border cooperation and just simply close the border. And if we think this way, we are not, in a really good situation. And it certainly needs to be improved. But now I think it had this kind of mental consequences, yes.
Yeah, and people tend to threat and fear are so strong that those kind of media images or representations certainly has an impact on people that we have proven through these recent cases, evidently. But thinking if we're trying to learn and improve, and as Adam said, not to get stuck on what went wrong, because what happened, right? Let's try to do better next time. What would be your tips or thinking for young journalists? How could we enhance understanding? How could we do better media coverage about the topics that wouldn't create barriers or kind of fuel polarization, but would kind of bring out at least the complex nature of things or an increase understanding between the people and the matters? What would you do? What kind of tips would you give?
Well, this is always the most difficult question, but I have two things that I usually try to answer to a question like this. First of all, try to avoid helicopter journalism, a journalism where someone from the capital comes to a remote region and does a story or two and then goes back. Not good. Instead, try to use local journalists in the work. Involve local journalists, not only as fixers, but really as journalists. Even if you still need fixers as well. especially when going to more difficult regions. And then maybe the most important thing is what again Sven-Erik already said: don't stop asking questions, not even in the places when things look like crystal clear. Still just continue asking questions, also difficult ones. And during the COVID pandemia, I think in Finnish side, some southern journalists, they indeed stopped ask questions about this border situation over here. When our president came and visited Tornio, one local journalist here asked him about the border closure, and he looked really surprised because no one had asked him about the thing, and he hadn't thought it at all that it would be a problematic thing for locals. If some of those journalists in capital had asked the question already, president had been able to, at least to know that there is such a discussion going on. So that was kind of a concrete example that people had stopped asking different kinds of questions.
I want to add on to that because I know of these incidents myself as an outsider, but I've heard that actually the surrounding colleagues of this one journalist actually were condescending on this journalist for having the nerve to ask this question. So
yeah, but
it was a bit of a controversial.
Yeah.
I heard about this incident as well.
Yeah, but that's really revealing. I think really illuminating.
Yeah.
And one should really, stop and think about what happened actually in the situation.
Yeah. But there was really a atmosphere of how dare you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just the president, like in the end. Like in thinking of the democratic nature, you should be able to ask any kind of questions. But coming to this, that this is maybe a good example about that we debated also a lot about the closing of the Uusimaa region, the southern Finland. So I guess it was covered much more because it had a direct influence on a lot of journalists from the bigger medias. And I guess this comes back to the question that we, of course, as humans tend to kind of report more about things that affect us as well. So that was a good point of trying to really also engage with people, like local people living in the place you go reporting, to actually get better understanding about things.
If you want to go deeper into the atmospheres and affects like deep streams inside the communities, you really need to stay a long time within the community, and it's not possible by just visiting a place and understanding what's happening inside. It takes time.
I will comment on one more thing that you said about helicopter journalism.
Yeah.
From my point of view, when the Swedish broadcasting radio station in Kemi reported on the pandemic, they were, even though they're just 30 kilometers away, but they were told by Yle, National Broadcasting Company, not to go to Sweden for 2 years. They weren't allowed to go to Sweden at all. And the perspective of being reporting away from this area, and I think reporters not living necessarily here, but living closer to Kemi area, certainly affected the reporting. Even for such a close news agent, it was certainly affecting their points of view.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, of course, it doesn't. It's not a magic trick to have a local journalists.
No.
It may help, but won't solve everything.
Yeah, and I guess the key thing that you said is the cooperation, right? We don't have to try to do everything ourselves or know all the answers ourselves. It's about like when working together with people. I guess that's the tip, that you can't do it necessarily alone.
Yeah.
And that was a good point. I guess we are slowly turning into end. Do you have something that you wanted to say but didn't have a chance?
No, not really. I think this was good, extensive discussion.
I have one thing I was thinking about, and as a closing thing to say, and I might get emotional saying it, but I will say it anyway. And I was trying in my head to rephrase it in English, but it was something that I came up with like a year or two ago. That time passes and the river flows. At times there are people who use the river to build barriers between themselves and others. At all times there are those who oppose it.
That was a really lovely way of putting actually the core meaning of this whole webinar series together, that this is why we are trying to create understanding about movement and migration and kind of bringing together people, right?